Hello, class. Sorry about that abrupt interruption. These days I had a doctor's appointment and it's one over the phone and he called early. So I had to take his call. You know how doctors are. So, where I abruptly left off, we're talking about Monroe's Doctrine. So, this is lecture 22 for History 101. And let me review what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. It was actually written by J.Q Adams. It's issued by President Monroe. And it's a foreign policy statement or doctrine. And basically it tells European powers, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The biggest point of concern is Mexico, which gains its independence in 1821. And the United States doesn't want another European power swooping in and recolonizing it, or any other independent nation. No further colonization in the Western Hemisphere, or the United States military will assist these countries in defending themselves against such colonization. So, but it's a two-way street, and Monroe pledges that the United States will stay out of European affairs, and we will not enter into any European land wars. Now, this is picking up from President Washington's farewell address and making it a official policy. Now, the Monroe Doctrine's policy as far as staying out of European land wars will last all the way till World War I. And even then, we're sort of dragged into that kicking and screaming. And for all intents and purposes, the Monroe Doctrine still exists today. And presidents from Theodore Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan have reissued it, where they basically argue we will not tolerate any colonization of the Western Hemisphere. Free independent nations are free and independent to stay. So it's a very important foreign policy statement doctrine. So what we want to move on to next is during this period also, there's an election year, 1820, and that's the election that I hinted around at earlier, the election in which President Monroe will run unopposed. Now, once again, there's no chart about this in the regular text. It's in the back on page A21. And if you look back there, you'll notice that Monroe receives all of the Electoral College votes because a Federalist doesn't run against him because they don't even exist anymore. And John Quincy Adams gets one vote. It's basically symbolic. One of the electors from the Electoral College decides that he's going to symbolically give his vote to the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, because he's so brilliant and done such a great job with the treaties he's negotiated, including getting Florida, where Spain basically pays us. So that's how popular Monroe and Adams are. So the next thing that we want to talk about, which is a domestic occurrence that happens during the Monroe two terms, is the famous Missouri Compromise. Now, if you take a look in your book on page 244, we have a map to help interpret what's going on here. But there's some background information I need to explain to you so you can fully understand the implications of the Missouri Compromise of 1820-21. Now, when you look at this map, you will notice how much the United States has grown. We know we added the Louisiana Territory, but we're already adding states out there. And look how many more states are on the map than were on the map previously when we looked at it. You know, we've added Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. Now, the way that they got into the habit of admitting states is they would admit them in pairs. So the reason they did this is they'd always admit one northern free state and one new southern slave state, because the idea was to keep this delicate balance in Congress between North and South, thus between slave and non-slave. Because underlying everything, all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, was this burning, dirty little issue of slavery. And it's becoming more and more a problem. So, the problem here that leads to the Missouri Compromise, Missouri has applied for statehood, but there isn't a northern non-slave state ready to enter the Union as a companion state. So northern congressmen are blocking the admission of Missouri. So the Speaker of the House at this point in history is a gentleman from Kentucky, and his name is Henry Clay. He is the one who's going to put together the Missouri Compromise, which will earn him the nickname, quote, the Great Compromiser. So, here's what it's all about. If you take a close look at the map, you'll notice Maine is labeled, and it's shown admitted as a free state 1820. Now, if you look at pre-1820 maps, Maine is part of Massachusetts. I can remember when I was first studying this, I thought it was a typo in the textbooks. But no, Maine was actually part of the state of Massachusetts, even though they're not geographically connected due to that real small coastline of New Hampshire that many of you have probably driven. Now, Maine had a state movement. They were sick and tired of being part of Massachusetts. They felt like, we're the forgotten part. They always think of us last. They're kind of like the unwanted stepchild or whatnot. So, Congress and Henry Clay approaches Massachusetts and asks them if they'd be willing to allow Maine to separate and become its own state. Because the Constitution requires, if there's a situation like this, for the state that's going to give up the territory to officially agree to it with their legislature and governor. And they agree. So, here's what the Missouri Compromise does. Another thing that I need to point out before I can completely explain it to you is we also have the phenomenon known as the Mason-Dixon Line. Now, many of you have probably heard of it. You don't know where it is unless you've driven along the East Coast. The Mason-Dixon Line, if you look at your map, is the southern border of Pennsylvania and the northern border of Maryland. A long time ago, the agreement was made that slavery would never exist north of the Mason-Dixon Line. Now, take a look at Missouri. Part of the northern section of Missouri, if you trace across, is above the so-called Mason-Dixon Line. This angers Northerners, too. So there's going to be more to this compromise besides just admitting Missouri and Maine as states. The other part of it is it's going to create what's known as the Missouri Compromise Line. And you can see that denoted on your map. And in fact, the exact parallel that it is, you can see labeled 3630. So, here's how it all works. Maine splits off from Massachusetts, becomes a state, and it's a northern free state. Missouri enters the Union as a slave state. But, according to this compromise, no further slave states will be allowed north of the Missouri Compromise line. So this, out west lowers the Mason-Dixon line. And as you can see by this map, if you pay close attention to it, this is a gigantic victory for abolitionists. The only area that is part of the United States at this point, remember in 1820-21, is the Arkansas Territory that is available for slave states to be carved out of. All that unorganized territory, which is the northern part of the Louisiana Territory, plus the Michigan Territory, which will become Wisconsin and Michigan, all that area is exclusively for free states now. That's a heck of a lot more territory than what the South has with the Arkansas Territory. And remember, Mexico's Mexico at this point, and it includes the entire southwestern United States and Texas. That's not an issue in 1820-21. So, big victory for abolitionists. And the great compromiser, Henry Clay, is the one who forges this, and it's passed in Congress. So, that's the Missouri Compromise. What we want to move on to next is we're moving right into Chapter 12. And the first thing that we want to cover is the highly controversial election of 1824. Now, in this election, we don't have any political parties. So if you look at the chart on page 854, you see there's 4 candidates running. And there's no party designation next to them because this is the very tail end of the era of good feelings. So both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans have sort of faded out of existence. So we got 4 candidates running. And when you first look at this chart, table 12.1, it appears Andrew Jackson won. He's got the most electoral college votes. He clearly has the most popular votes. But according to the Constitution, you have to have a majority of the electoral college. And 99 electoral college votes is not a majority. All 4 candidates received electoral college votes, including John Quincy Adams received a significant number, 84. So when that happens, the rules that kick in are the election goes to the House of Representatives. The top 3 candidates are whom are considered by the House for who's going to be the president. Now, you'll notice the person who finishes 3rd in electoral college votes, and that's what counts, is a candidate by the name of Crawford. Before the House can even start considering who they're going to elect, Crawford has a debilitating stroke and he drops out of the race. Henry Clay can't just jump up to be number 3 because it's only the top 3. So this turns it into a two-person race in the House between former General Andrew Jackson and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Now, what's going to happen before any votes can be cast in the House of Representatives? The 4th place finisher, the great compromiser himself, Henry Clay, will speak to the House. He's the Speaker of the House. And he'll basically tell them he is throwing all of his support and he's endorsing John Quincy Adams to be the next president of the United States. And he encourages all his colleagues in the House to vote for Adams also. So, when he does this, he has a tremendous amount of power in the House, The House follows suit, and they elect the second place finisher in Electoral College votes and clearly in popular vote, John Quincy Adams, as the next president of the United States. So Adams wins the election of 1820 in the House of Representatives. Now, right off the bat, Andrew Jackson cries foul, because very shortly after John Quincy Adams becomes president, he appoints Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. Now, here's what's wrong with that, especially as far as Andrew Jackson is concerned. Henry Clay has absolutely no foreign policy experience whatsoever. He's been in the House, he's been the Speaker of the House. As far as domestic policy goes, like forging the Missouri Compromise, he's a leading expert. As far as negotiating treaties, he doesn't know squat. Now, here's the other problem that many of you have not considered, I'm sure. The Secretary of State position at this point in American history is the stepping stone to the presidency. Let's think back. Thomas Jefferson, who will serve 2 terms as president, was President Washington's Secretary of State. It gains you the foreign policy experience you need to be well suited to be president. The next president, James Madison, was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. The next president, James Monroe, was Madison's Secretary of State. And obviously, we know John Quincy Adams was Monroe's Secretary of State. So it appears if you want to be president, you better be Secretary of State. So Andrew Jackson cries foul and refers to this whole ordeal of appointing Henry Clay to be the Secretary of State as the so-called corrupt bargain. So Andrew Jackson, a very fiery guy, feels like he got shafted out of the presidency. He won the Electoral College vote, he won the popular vote, but due to this corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay, he's not president. So essentially, he's going to start campaigning for the presidency before John Quincy Adams is even sworn in March of 1825. And he's going to be campaigning and criticizing every move by Adams and Clay. So the era of good feelings certainly comes to a screeching halt. And as we're going to find out, we have 2 new parties who are going to emerge out of this that we'll talk about in the next election, the election of 1828. Now, the first thing that brand new President Adams and Henry Clay attempt to do is they want to push through Congress a huge domestic package that they're going to refer to as the American system. And there's really 2 parts to the American system. The first part that they attempt to push through Congress is the creation of a national canal system. Now, the reason why canals are such a hot topic, the Erie Canal opened in 1824 and was an immediate success and a real economic boom to the state of New York and the Midwest. It's really what put New York City on the map. New York City had been the 3rd largest city up until the Erie Canal opens, and it's going to grow like a weed because the industry in New York City now can ship its items up the Hudson to the Erie Canal, across the state of New York, to the Great Lakes, and supply all the settlement that's happening out there in Ohio, Michigan, and the Great Lakes region. This is what really puts New York City on the map. So it's a really big economic success story. And on the tails of that, Adams and Clay, and especially Clay's the architect of all these domestic policies. That's his forte. John Quincy Adams is a foreign policy guy. He promotes the building of a national canal system. Build canals up and down the east coast, connecting the coastline with the interior in order to improve transportation and augment the economy. Now, you also have to remember, this is the mid-1820s. Railroads are not a factor yet in the United States. We really don't have any. So, canals are seen as the name of the game. That's part of the American system. It's put up for a vote in the House, but Andrew Jackson is campaigning behind the scenes and traveling all across the country, speaking to anybody that'll listen to him, encouraging them to contact their members of Congress to tell them to vote no on the National Canal System. And here's his rationale. The Erie Canal was constructed without the federal government spending a penny on it. It was all paid for by private investors and the state of New York. So Jackson argues, if all these other states want canals, let them follow the Erie Canal model and pay for it themselves. Plus, he's very suspicious of this gigantic bureaucracy that'll be created. Who knows what it'd be called? The National Canal Administration or whatever. It'd be this gigantic monstrosity throwing money around that Jackson's dead set against. So, his message about the canal rings true with many Americans, and Congress votes it down. Now, the second part of the American system is the creation of a national university. Now, all colleges and universities in the United States up to this point are private. There are no state universities to speak of. A handful have popped up, but what the Adams-Clay administration suggests that we should follow suit like major European countries do. And we should build a national university to be our largest and most prestigious institution and house it in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And they believe that this will offer higher education to more Americans, and it'll really put us on par with our European counterparts. Now, of course, the biggest critic of the National University is Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson claims this National University is going to be built at taxpayer expense so that the children of the elites can attend it at a lower cost than it will cost them to go to a private university. And his argument goes further saying, and you've got to think about this, in 1825, public education K through 8 is just coming online in most states. It'll become a reality pretty quickly, but most people up to that point didn't go to school. All the schools were private. Massachusetts was the first to create a public education system under the guidance of Horace Mann, and the states are going to follow suit and have them all in place by 1828. But still, if you wanted to go to high school all the way through the Civil War, high schools were all private, tuition-bearing institutions. So Andrew Jackson's arguing, you're going to build this university for the kids of John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and the other politicians and elites. Your children won't be going there, will they? And when he speaks to average Americans, they all agree, no, there's no way my son's going to the National University. He's not even going to go to high school, for Christ's sakes. So, when Jackson puts it that way, Americans agree, pressure their members of Congress, And the second part of the American system, the national university, is voted down. Now, I would argue, even though Andrew Jackson really didn't know the future, this was a smart move. Because if we had to put all our eggs in one basket, that would have probably stopped the federal government from subsidizing state universities all across the country, which they'll do in 1861 with the Morrill Land Grant Act that'll build major public universities all across the United States, subsidized by the federal government, instead of just building one in D.C. So, even though Jackson didn't realize that, that's the case. So, that's the end of lecture number 22 for History 101. I'll be picking up shortly later on this week to deliver a couple more lectures, but that's where I'm going to call her quits today. As you can see, I'm getting hoarse. So I'll be also working on grading quiz number 2, and the next module will open up by tomorrow at noon, as I mentioned before. So everybody, I hope you're healthy. Be safe. Stay home. We'll get through this. I'll see you soon.